In this video of the Historical Ordnance series, I have another improvised mine to show you here. I and Combat Cameraman have been working on this off and on for about a week and doing what research we could to get specifics on this. What you see here is a rough example of a former Czechoslovakian PTMID wooden anti-tank mine. Now, this mine actually is an evolution of another mine, a World War II era German mine that was known as the Holzmine 42, wooden mine 42, which obviously that entered into service with the German Army in 1942. At the end of World War II, as I've mentioned in some other videos, a lot of countries adopted German ordnance. And even if they didn't adopt it, they adopted German designs. And this is one that Czechoslovakia adopted, but they made some differences. First off, the Holzmine was 12 inches by 12 inches by 5 inches. The Czech version is 12.5 inches by 9 inches by 5 inches. And with the top of the pressure board here, it can be anywhere between 5.5 to 7.5 inches in height, depending on the size of the board that's used for the pressure board. The German version weighed 18 pounds. The Czech version weighs 18.75 pounds. The German version had for an explosive filler 11 pounds of amytal. The Czech version, 12 1/3 pounds of TNT. So down here I have kind of a simulate for you to look at. I have 12 1-pound blocks of simulated TNT. So this amount of explosive was supposed to fit inside this. And I and Combat Cameraman, as we're going through cutting the pieces, piecing it together, and getting a look at it as we're assembling it, we're wondering really how did they fit all of this into here. Now this mine, according to the information we got out of the Czech Republic, it had for its filler 28 blocks, 7 ounce each of TNT, a standard explosive block that was used by the Warsaw Pact. So maybe the fact that the packages were smaller than this, they were smaller than half pound size sticks. Maybe that's how they got it in here. It was just a lot of creative plugging and chugging just to fit it all in here. Now, what I found interesting and why I'm doing this video on this is the general construction on this thing. Now with the German version, their pressure board looked the same, but it was on one end of the box. The Czechs moved it to the center. And they also changed how it was fused. With the Czech version here, it uses, well, one of two types of fuses. The RO1 pole fuse, the same type of fuse they used with their concrete stake mines, or it used the RO-7-1 pressure fuse, which was a very common pressure fuse used in their anti-tank mines. And how it was set up is what I find really interesting. You have the pressure board here, which sits on top of 2 trigger boards. Each trigger board, if you can see here, has a cutout notch for the RO1 pole fuse. And these little cradles here are what the pole fuse would sit on so that it was in position. Now these pressure boards were held in place by 2 1/4-inch wooden dowels. And it reportedly took between 440 to 990 pounds of pressure on top of the pressure board to push it down, break the wooden dowels, and push the trigger boards down to set off the fuse. Now the little cradle here for the RO1 fuse also worked as a base for the RO7-1 fuse. So when it was in pressure mode, you had probably a smaller piece of board than what I have here. Something that was probably like half the size. You had the little half-pound block, 7-ounce block of explosive down there. The pressure fuse was attached into that. This was the base underneath it. And then what would happen, you get sufficient pressure on top of the pressure board here, break the trigger boards, this would come down and then set off a pressure fuse on either side, setting off the explosive. Now this mine could use either 2 RO1s or 2 RO or 7-1s, or it could use one of each, whatever was available. These were common fuses. So that's why the Czech government came up with an improvised version of this mine that could use either one, depending on what the partisan had available. So this is a basic design. When I was looking at some of the pictures of existing models that are still in museums, it looks like they're primarily made out of half-inch boards, common half-inch boards. And the pressure board was most likely some type of 2x3 or 2x4. The cradles down in here was kind of hard to tell. It looked like some of them, at least the ones that were meant for use with the pole fuse, were basically like a 2x2 like I'm using here. Or if it was meant for use with the pressure fuse, it looked like it was just a 1-inch board, thick board down at the bottom as the cradle. Now these mines were produced. They were in the inventory of the Czechoslovakian army. They were declared obsolete and removed from service in 1973, the same time that they removed the concrete stake mine. Now this particular mine has seen combat service, but only in one location, and that is Angola. But it's still a very interesting design. There are some things that I want to point out on this, on ways that I and Combat Cameraman were thinking on how to ease production on these or improve them just a little bit. Before I get into that, I should mention that there was provisions for this mine for anti-handling devices. And one of the things that was done when this was produced, they put in 2 holes for tripwires to be run through the bottom of the mine to come up to get tied off onto the combat pin of the RO1 fuse, so that if the deminer comes in, just grabs it, doesn't check it, tries pulling it out of the ground, that tripwire, which is attached to an anchor underneath, will pull the combat pin out of the fuse, setting off the mine in his face. Another thing that I came across was for if it was being used with the pressure fuses, there were notes in NATO sources from during the Cold War that the materials that they had gotten a hold of from the Czechoslovakian army on these stated that in the center here, between the 2 pressure fuses, if you're using the RO7-1s, they were supposed to locate a pressure release device like an M5 mousetrap, so that if the deminer comes in, he doesn't take it out of the ground, he just grabs the pressure board and removes it. It would take the pressure off of that mousetrap, setting off the mine that way. Now, some of the things Iron Combat Cameraman talked about for improvements on this that we definitely could see. First off, the 12 by 9 dimension seems a bit small. Most of the improvised wooden mines that I've done so far, and I've done for Antitank, I've done the TMD Bravo and the TM62D, they were 12 by 12. And the mine that this was based off of was a 12 by 12 also. So that would be one change that I think a resistant soldier would have to do. By doing that, you're adding more explosive in there, taking it out of the anti-vehicular category, potentially getting it back up into anti-tank, because the 12 pounds of TNT in here, that's really not enough to damage a tank very badly, but it will heavily damage a lightly armed wheeled vehicle. Now, another improvement that we've seen or thought of is the top here, how we got this set up. Now, in the actual Czech blueprints that they have for this, they don't have two boards sitting on top like this. What they have is the sideboards come up, and then the top boards here slide in from the side. They have it basically set as a tongue and groove system, with the groove cut into the sideboard and the tongue cut on these top boards so that it would just slide into place. That seems like a lot of extra work. Why do that when you can do something like this, just putting two boards over the top, taking out one step of production, and it's still going to work. Another thing, and I've seen different ways of doing this, some of the pictures of the mines that are in museums, they show dovetail cuts on the side to glue it all together. I came across one though that did this. You had kind of a halfway cut on both boards, which fit together and lock into place. So this, the sideboards hold down the front and back boards. This, I think, is also a way to hasten production, make things easier. I think the pressure board and trigger boards is a pretty good idea, even if a different type of fuse would be used underneath here. Just having this set up so that it takes at least 440 pounds to set this off is a pretty good idea. And having the trigger boards held in with wooden dowels, which are just glued in. Good idea, simple materials. Now, actually making the parts for this. I was thinking through the easiest thing that a resistance soldier could do is do up a few pieces that they can use as guides for putting down onto the raw boards for cutting out. So obviously pressure board would be one. Another one would be the trigger board. That would be one that potentially you would want a example that you could just lay down and trace out and then cut around. The front and the back, one board on that, and one board on the side piece also for just tracing out and cutting and drilling. The cradles in here, I'd say it would depend on the type of fusing that you would use inside this. You do want a good base inside here so that you're not just constantly pushing the fuse down inside and it may not go off. Having these cradles in here was actually a pretty good idea because it stabilizes that fuse in there, allowing sufficient pressure to come down on the fuse to set it off. So maybe something along this lines, depending on the type of fuse that would be used. Now, something we did not put on here, and it was because of failure of materials. This is thrown together literally out of wood scraps, bits of pallet and other stuff that I had laying around. On the front of the mine, there's supposed to be a carrying handle. So in the pictures, you have a piece of wood up here, say about 3" by 3" or 3" by 4". And that piece of wood has a rope handle that it secures to the front that you can grab onto to carry the mine. We did not put that on here because it was a failure of materials, but it would be something that I think would be pretty useful to have on here, or do like the Russians did with their improvised mines for teaching the partisans. Just tack it on to the side so you got some way to carry the mine. Now, this mine did have a couple safety devices. In the actual blueprints, it shows that you could include a safety pin in this. So there was a hole drilled on either side that nails or cotter pins were put in to act as safety pins so nothing would happen to the pressure board. And during transport, the pressure board was actually flipped upside down. So it would come out of storage, the gorilla would go through, fill it with explosives. They would take it to the site where it's going to be emplaced, and the actual ones produced by the Czechs in the pictures, they all had 2 screws and the top boards here. It's just theirs were on the edge. You go through, unscrew one of these top boards, remove the pressure board, insert your fuses, flip your pressure board over, screw your top back on, and put your mine in the ground and camouflage it. So, interesting mine. Definitely one that I think would be very useful to any type of resistance organization that is trying to fight off an invading force. So here's one for you to research, look up a little bit more. The Czech PT-MID wooden anti-tank mine. Now, for all my engineer brothers and the Patriot and militia movements, always remember essayons.